Lycoming and Continental both say that if an aeroplane's not going to be flown either weekly or every couple of weeks, that it should be stored properly, otherwise you get internal corrosion in the engine. And I have my own way of doing this. I have a Continental engine, I have a Lycoming engine, I have a couple of Volkswagen Aero-Engines, and I need to store them all for a month or two each winter. So I make a point of running them, flying them, getting the engine good and hot, and then draining out all the oil. And then I replace the oil with brand new oil filter, all the usual things, with a normal amount of oil. I then just run it for a minute or two, probably not even that, maybe 30 or 40 seconds, to distribute this new, thick, not thinned, cold oil all around the engine, and then turn off the engine, and that should distribute the oil around the engine as much as possible. I then fill up the crankcase right up to the top with oil. On the Lycoming engine it's the most important. This Lycoming engine here has its camshaft at the top of the engine. The engine takes about 24 litres or 24 quarts, whichever is your preferred unit of measurement. So what I do is I fill the sump of the engine, or I fill the whole crankcase of the engine full of oil. I take out the top spark plugs and fill the cylinders full of oil and leave them like that over the winter, with the exhaust sealed, with the intakes sealed, with the breather sealed, with desiccant plugs in the top of the cylinders to keep it all dry. The oil I use is Aeroshell 15W50. I use that particular oil because, like any multi-grade, it is thinner when cold but thicker when hot than a straight weight oil, and Shell puts lots of corrosion inhibitors in it. And a man from Castrol, who also make aviation oils, gave us a presentation in which he told us all sorts of things about oils and lubrication, and one of the things he did say was that the aviation oil with the greatest number of corrosion inhibitors was Aeroshell 15W50. And if Mr. Castrol's representative claims that Aeroshell 15W50 has the most corrosion inhibitors in it, that's the one for me to use. And then when I come back in the spring, first of all, because this is a tail wheel aeroplane, and obviously the rear end of the camshaft may be wet still there, but the front end isn't, I lift up the tail of the aeroplane and make sure that the front of the camshaft is as wet as I can make it, make everything in the engine, top and bottom, as wet as I can make it. Then I take the lower plugs out of the cylinders, drain out the oil from the cylinders, drain out the oil from the engine, refill it with the correct amount of oil, which is 6 quarts, go away, come back the next day, put the plugs back in the lower cylinders, and then crank the engine with the plugs missing from the top cylinders to distribute the oil around the engine as much as I possibly can, then put back the top plugs and then start the engine. You get a bit of smoke out when you start, but that should ensure that as much as possible the whole engine has been washed with oil, covered with oil before the beginning of the winter, that no moist air can get into the engine during the winter by sealing up all the holes, and that everything is as wet with oil as it possibly can be before you start actually running the engine in the spring. In the engine over the winter, we drain it out in the spring when I come back to the engine, and then store it, and I can use it throughout the summer, putting it back in the engine. It's not in any way, it's not as if the engine has been run with this oil in it. It hasn't. So there's no contaminants, no acids or anything like that in the oil. It's just simply been sitting in the engine and protecting it throughout the winter. Hydraulic lock. The problem is that if you've got oil in the cylinder and both the spark plugs are in place, the oil can, there could be a volume of oil in the cylinder that is greater than the combustion chamber, and what happens when you crank the engine then is that the piston comes up the cylinder hard against this incompressible oil, and you'll bend your con rod. Yeah, you have to be careful. I fill all 4 cylinders with oil with the lower spark plugs in place when I winterize the engine. I then put desiccant plugs in the top spark plug positions. Now during the winter some of the oil dribbles out through the inlet or the exhaust valves, and some of the cylinders, one cylinder usually has an inlet valve open, one cylinder usually has an exhaust valve open. When I come back in the spring, I drain out all the oil from all 4 cylinders by taking out the 4 lower spark plugs and from the crankcase, and I'll leave it overnight like that to make sure all the oil is drained out. I then put the lower spark plugs back in, but take out the desiccant plugs that are in the top of the engine, and as Lycoming recommend in their Lycoming Flyer reprints, I crank the engine over with the top plugs missing. That ensures that there's some splash lubrication of the camshaft and the cam followers from the crankshaft splashing around in the oil, but it also ensures that any oil, residual oil that is left in the cylinders is blown out through the upper spark plugs. You don't get much, you get a little bit of spray from oil from the upper plugs, and of course it's blown out through the exhaust system, blown out through the upper plugs, and after I've cranked it for 40 seconds or a minute or whatever, you can be pretty sure there's no oil left in there, so there is no danger of hydraulicking.